All right, so welcome everyone to this teach-in given by the Platypus Affiliated Society. This event is a teach-in by Richard Rubin of the Platypus Affiliated Society on Engels' Dialectics of Nature, which is, this teaching coincides with Engels' 200th birthday, which was yesterday. Also in commemoration of Engels' 200th birthday, our Manchester, England chapter hosted 2 panels yesterday on the housing question, and you can find those on our, shortly will be up on our YouTube page if you just search for the Platypus Affiliated Society. The Platypus Affiliated Society, founded in 2006, is a education project focusing on the death of the left. We conduct research, journalism, we host panels, and we have reading groups in chapters around the world, investigating the tasks and problems inherited from the old 20s to 30s, new 60s to 70s, post-political 80s to 90s, and perhaps now we can add the millennial left of the 2000s. We have several chapters around the world, across America, Europe, and parts of Asia. If you would like to get involved in a Platypus chapter near you, you can email Platypus Coordinator, which is, the email address is on our website, platypus1917.org, and you can see there a list of chapters with contact information in your area. We also hosted a panel last night from our Virginia chapter on after the election, what's the future for the left. That's already up on our YouTube page, and I encourage you to watch it. For tonight's presentation, I'll hand over to Richard, who will speak for about half an hour, maybe a bit more. Okay, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A and discussion. I think the best thing will be for me to unmute you in the audience, and you can ask your questions directly to Richard. But if you would like to send a written question in the chat, then that's fine as well, and I will read it out. So without further ado, I will mute myself and hand over to Richard.
Okay, can you hear me? So yesterday was Friedrich Engels' 200th birthday. Happy belated birthday, Fred. This talk was originally scheduled for yesterday, but because of a conflict with another Platypus event, it was moved to today. I will talk today not about Engels' contributions to Marxism in general, but only about one small and admittedly quite marginal aspect of his oeuvre, Dialectics of Nature. This was not like the editing of Das Kapital or his political work, a central part of Engels' contribution, but rather something that he worked on intermittently in his spare time, which he did not complete and was not published in his lifetime. Nevertheless, it was a work that he valued, and so did Marx. It was also a work that has had a significant afterlife in Marxist thought. A classic has been described as a book that prompts continued rereadings and reinterpretations with each new generation of readers. In this respect, Dialectics of Nature is a classic that continues to stimulate, perplex, and also, in many cases, repel Marxist readers. If for no other reason, it deserves our attention. Like most classics, it is also more acknowledged than read. Can everyone hear me? In addition to honoring Karl Marx's close collaborator on the occasion of the bicentennial of his birth, this talk is also a response to something else. A few months ago, I was engaged in a discussion with various people in Platypus, both on and off the OrgCom, about a possible philosophy and Marxism reading group modeled on the very successful art and politics groups of this summer. At a certain point, the question of including Dialectics of Nature and Materialism and Imperial Criticism came up. But despite my advocacy, the general feeling was that these texts did not fit into the general narrative Platypus provides about the relationship between the rise and crisis of bourgeois society, Marxism, and philosophy. Both of these texts, which I would emphasize, are quite different from each other, nevertheless have certain things in common. and it fit very awkwardly into a standard platypus treatment of philosophy. Although both are by central figures in our platypus Marxist canon, their assumptions, style, and subject matter seem to render them quite alien to the philosophical concerns of platypus. Indeed, in a frank moment, many a platypus member trying to read them may admit to finding them either opaque or embarrassing. Chris, however, both urged and challenged me to present talks on them in a way that made sense to me. I'm taking up part of this challenge today. This teach-in is thus part of a broader attempt, like recent articles in the Platypus Review, to address how platypus talks about philosophy. I'm not presuming, unlike the situation in a reading group, that anybody listening to me will actually have read Dialectics of Nature. I hope, rather, that I might be giving platypus members reasons to read a text that at first glance will probably seem quite esoteric and irrelevant to platypus, and to think about it. Probably, of course, some of you have actually read it, and some perhaps recently enough to remember. In this case, that will be good for the discussion. I will proceed, however, on the assumption that you, a generalized abstract listener, have not read it and may even be hearing of it for the first time. This, however, complicates my pedagogical approach. I will begin by talking about a controversy about a book, and then only at the end, as an afterthought, so to speak, try to describe briefly the actual contents of the book. Indeed, the actual content of the book approached directly can be an obstacle, since the largest part of it consists of descriptions of now antiquated natural science. This aspect of the book is actually quite fascinating to me, but it does require a certain familiarity with 19th century natural science. At the end of this talk, however, I will try to briefly address Engels' non-specialist but quite intelligent attempt to grapple with the picture of the universe presented by Victorian natural science and the tremendous intellectual achievement it represented, although large parts of it have now certainly been surpassed. First, however, let me introduce Friedrich Engels and Dialectics of Nature. You presumably know something already about Engels because he voluntarily subordinated himself to Karl Marx for most of his intellectual career. Engels has naturally tended to be regarded in Marx's shadow. I cannot deny, he said, that both before and during my 40 years collaboration with Marx, I had a certain independent share in laying the foundations of the theory. Engels wrote after his friend's death, but the greater part of its leading principles belongs to Marx. Marx was a genius. We others were at best talented. Without him, the theory would not be by far what it is today. It therefore rightly bears his name. This faith in Marx's genius was what convinced Engels to step back, sacrifice the development of his own ideas, and play second fiddles to so splendid a first fiddle as Marx, as he put it. But as his biographer put it in a recent article in The Guardian, Engels was a figure of profound historical and philosophical significance. Yet what I discovered as his biographer was that his vision of socialism could also be richly uplifting. The grisly, corrupt, anti-intellectual, egalitarian Marxism of the 20th century would have horrified him. The concept of a socialist society as a realm of equality is a one-sided French concept, he said. Instead, Engels believed in cascading the pleasures of life, food, sex, drink, culture, travel, even fox hunting, across all classes. Socialism should not be a never-ending Labour Party meeting, but a life of enjoyment. The real challenge of living in Manchester, he said, was that he could find no single opportunity to make use of my acknowledged gift for mixing a lobster salad. While not commenting on his talent for lobster salad, J.B.S. Haldane, himself a great polymath, in his introduction to Dialectics of Nature, was able to describe Engels as perhaps the most educated man of his time. And Lenin poetically described the Marx-Engels friendship as equaling the greatest friendships of antiquity. He was also a wealthy man and a generous one who, because of his wealth, was able to subsidize Marx. Capitalists are rarely revolutionary socialists, but Engels was. He actually hated his work as a capitalist. This was because of his family. I mean, in modern terms, he would be a top executive, top corporate executive, but he was in his family's textile business. And he also lived in a very bourgeois way. This is a side note. And one of the amusing anecdotes I learned recently is that during a debate in the early 2000s on trying to ban fox hunting, that someone in the House of Lords cited in defense of fox hunting Friedrich Engels against Labor Party leftist vegans. Yet the relationship between Marx and Engels has not always been understood so unproblematically. Indeed, along with the not unrelated question of the relationship between Marx and Hegel, the relationship between Marx and Engels has created philosophical divisions among those who claim the mantle of Marxism, even functioning somewhat as a shibboleth. Furthermore, there's a great deal of heterogeneity even among those who are in either the pro-Engels or anti-Engels camp. In the pro-Engels camp, for example, are certainly found the Stalinists, but also the Trotskyists, and nowadays also eco-socialists. It's hard to understand what exactly the political basis then of sympathy for dialectics of nature is. Perhaps once again, the close relationship often postulated by Marxists between philosophical positions and political ones does not always exist. But on the anti-Engels side, there is an equal heterogeneity. What exactly is the charge against Engels? According to Norman Levine, who is at the extreme end of Engels phobia, the problem is that Engels botches Hegel. The true heir of Hegel is Marx, whose understanding of Hegel supposedly differs from Engels. But for Lucio Coletti, the problem with Engels is on the contrary, that Engels is too Hegelian. Indeed, Engels is indeed faithful to Hegel, but that is the problem. Marx, however, according to Coletti, is unconsciously Kantian. What both of these otherwise irreconcilable positions have in common is that they claim to have found a philosophical distinction between Marx and Engels and prefer Marx and treat Engels as falling below the great man. In general, anti-Engelsism may be described as related to a new left-inspired Marxology that wants to go back to a purified Marx and takes its inspiration from a philosophical Marx more than a political one. In the process of going back to this idealized and subtly philosophical Marx, Engels has been made the vulgarizing, treacherous devil who needs to be cast out and, like Milton's Satan, hurled headlong, flaming from the ethereal sky with hideous ruin and combustion down to bottomless perdition there to dwell. As Norman Levine tells the story, by the term re-Hegelianization, I refer to those philosophers who recognize the continuity between Hegel and Marx. From their own perspectives, these intellectuals set forth a literature showing the exact categories of Hegelian thought that Marx incorporated. These 20th century re-Hegelianizers broke with the 19th century interpretation of the Hegel-Marx association as represented by Engels, who offered a totally corrupted version of Hegel, divorced Hegel and Marx, and invented dialectical materialism. Engels gave rise to philosophical Stalinism because Stalinist theory was predicated on both diamat and the sundering of Hegel and Marx. The formula is clear: good, Hegel, Marx; bad, Engels, Lenin, Stalin. It is a useful story for a certain kind of Marxism that has been traumatized by the 20th century. But the entire scenario seems psychologically unreasonable. As Sebastiano Timpanaro observes, Marx is supposed to have been witness to the decimation of his philosophy by his closest friend and collaborator without batting an eyelash. As can be shown by the correspondence between the two of them, Marx followed closely the germination of the Dialectics of Nature. He read all of Anti-Düring before its publication and collaborated on it by writing a chapter of it. And yet he supposedly never felt the need to disassociate himself from a metaphysical construction that was the antithesis of his own thought. This objection may not have the merit of being new, but it does have the merit of never having received a satisfactory reply. Nor do I think it could receive one. Those like Schmidt, who still talk about the difference between Marxism and Engelsism in somewhat obscure terms, may perhaps be content to remark that it cannot be established how far Marx was conscious of this difference between his concept of nature and Engels. Those like Coletti, who sharpened the difference to the point that it becomes a matter of Engels' complete misunderstanding, take away any likely explanation of Marx's silence. Everyone who begins by representing Engels in the role of banalizer and distorter of Marx's thought inevitably ends up finding many of Marx's own statements too Engelsian. How then shall one proceed amid the maze of arguments that seem to surround this strange book? One might begin with a logical and rigorous examination of the concepts of dialectics in nature. But I suggest that instead, we rather examine the history of philosophy itself. In many of my debates with Chris and others on the list in the past about philosophy, I have been accused of being obsessed with, quote, philosophy of science, unquote. I think that this is a misunderstanding. Such a formulation presumes that there is a specialized academic field in which I happen to be interested, but which is peripheral to the true story of philosophy. Instead of representing a specialized interest, my attitude stems from a nostalgia for a lost intellectual unity, and a sense that this loss, whether recoverable or not, is a tremendously important part of the story of modern thought. The story of modern philosophy, one has been taught in Platypus over and over, is about bourgeois society and freedom. To this I say, yes, and. It is quite right to emphasize Rousseau, for example, as the background for Kant, but we should also, even if not necessarily for the purposes that Platypus is engaged with, recognize the importance of Newton. To quote Adorno, a prerequisite for understanding Kant that is absolutely involved in his philosophy is the fact that underlying Kant's philosophy lies a huge confidence in the mathematical natural sciences, and that his philosophy is absolutely full of the spirit of those sciences. If we wish to grasp the chief inspiration of the critique of pure reason, we might locate it at the idea that the attempts of metaphysics to arrive at absolute certainties by spinning them out of mere thought have all failed, and Hume was right to criticize them. But that does not mean that we should despair, because thanks to the persuasive force of the mathematical sciences, particularly mathematics itself and what today we should call theoretical physics, we possess an entire body of knowledge that actually does satisfy the criterion of absolute truth. Kant's achievement only becomes comprehensible on the assumption that science provides the absolute knowledge which merely abstract speculation had failed to deliver. Yet something has clearly changed since the time of Kant in terms of the relationship of philosophy to natural science. Hans Reichenbach, an early analytical philosopher associated with the Vienna Circle, wrote, if the philosophical, actually he was associated with the Berlin Circle, which was affiliated with the Vienna Circle, but ideologically similar. If the philosophical method of our time is compared with the method of the great system builders of the 17th and 18th centuries, a fundamental difference in the respective attitudes to the natural sciences becomes evident. The classical philosophers had a close connection with the science of their time. Some of them, such as Descartes and Leibniz, were leading mathematicians and physicists themselves. More recently, philosophy and science have become estranged, a situation which has led to an unproductive tension between these two groups. The philosophers, whose professional training has usually been acquired in the pursuit of historical and philological studies, accuse the scientists of too much specialization and turn instead to metaphysical problems. The scientists, on the other hand, miss in philosophy the treatment of the epistemological problems, which, though solved by a Leibniz or Kant within the framework of the science of their time, demand a fresh analysis within the framework of contemporary science. This alienation is expressed by the mutual contempt which each understands, in which each understands the purposes of the other's endeavors. Looking back into history, one can trace the roots of this division through the 19th century. For Kant, knowledge as realized in mathematical physics was still the starting point of epistemology. Although this basis constitutes a certain one-sidedness of his system, it also accounts for the strength of his epistemological position, to which his philosophy owes its great influence. It is surprising, however, little use Kant made of scientific results in the elaboration of his system, how little scientific material he employed in his main epistemological works, even in the form of examples. He must have seen the scientific conception of knowledge as a whole and created his system out of this experience, which produced, as the result of an analysis of pure reason, the very conception of knowledge of the mathematical physics of his time. How well he must have explicated this conception of knowledge can be inferred from the vivid interest expressed by the natural scientists, whether they were adversaries or adherents. A clarification of their position with respect to Kant seemed to be natural and necessary to them, and they gradually identified Kant's doctrine with philosophy as such. But Kant's solution of the metaphysical problems was at the same time the last one in which science played a role. Later, philosophical systems had no longer any connection with the science of their time. And although some of them, such as the Schelling and the Hegel's natural philosophy, treated scientific material to a larger extent than Kant, their philosophy of nature is a naive evaluation of scientific results rather than a true understanding of the spirit of scientific research. Since then, science and philosophy have remained separated. The speculative and rationalist analytic components of Kant's system were preserved, while the relationship to science was renounced. The philosopher allied himself to the humanities. So far as science interested him at all, he surmised that the problem of science had been solved since Kant, and that a further development of science consisted only in filling out Kant's program, a conception which even in the more flexible form of the Neo-Kantian school could not be prevented from coming into conflict with the actual development of science. Science, in the meantime, went its own way. Certainly one cannot approach Kant for not anticipating this development, but neither can one expect the modern scientist to acknowledge Kant's philosophy as the basis of his own epistemology. Neither in Kant nor in the prevailing schools of philosophy does he find an epistemology that enables him to understand his own scientific activity. Philosophy still acts like a stranger towards the gigantic complex of natural science, even to the point of rejecting it. Sorry about the long quotation. One need not accept Reichenbach's judgments about specific philosophers or his own philosophical views to recognize that he has in fact diagnosed a cultural epistemological crisis. The realm of philosophy has over the last few centuries, in Seinfeldian terms, experienced shrinkage. Of course, the solution that Reichenbach and his co-thinkers hoped for has not panned out either. The idea that philosophy could find a new role for itself as a handmaiden to the natural sciences, clarifying their task for them, not unlike the relationship of theology to philosophy in the Middle Ages, now seems a failure because for philosophy to be reduced to such a role is to become trivial and uninteresting to most people who seek in philosophy a guide to life, not an analysis of language. It also turned out to be unnecessary to science itself, which muddles on perfectly well without philosophy. But a question remains. If a Leibniz could participate equally in discussions about metaphysics, physics, and mathematics, why then has the first of these removed itself from the other two, whose alliance remains firmer than ever? Are we to consider this an emancipation of philosophy from natural science and natural science from philosophy? Or should we rather regard it as a tragic disintegration of intellectual unity into specialized realms that cannot anymore talk to one another? Is this simply an inevitable specialization of knowledge that comes from the massive growth of knowledge, or is this separation, which has become so naturalized, itself a manifestation of the degeneration of bourgeois society? This question lies, I believe, at the heart of the debate about dialectics of nature and its place in the Marxist canon. The reason that works like Dialectics of Nature and Materialism and Imperial Criticism are such awkward books for a philosophically inclined Marxism is that by their very subject matter, they seem to imply that Marxism should engage philosophically with natural science. But what, to paraphrase Tertullian, does the theory of relativity have to do with the dictatorship of the proletariat? The idea, however, of a possible connection between these apparently disparate realms, while frequently rejected, nevertheless persists in haunting Marxism. It rests on two assumptions. Firstly, that politics and metaphysics are intertwined, and secondly, that physics and metaphysics are. Metaphysics is then the potential bridge between natural science and Marxism. In preparing for this talk, I asked Theo, Jensen, and Chris to give me their definitions of some terms. For the most part, their definitions of dialectics were similar, but there was an interesting divergence around the term materialism, which points to a fundamental philosophical tension in Marxism. Both Theo and Chris define materialism by reference to matter as the ontological priority of matter. And I think one was something very similar. These definitions, however, raise the question, what is matter? Does matter understood as a philosophical category have anything to do with matter as studied by physicists and chemists? Does Marxist materialism really have anything to do with electrons? And how does matter, or acknowledging the priority of matter, then determine our view of human society? Jensen, on the other hand, offered an alternative definition of materialism without reference to matter at all, emphasizing rather the primacy of sensuous human activity, to use Marx's phrase from the thesis on Feuerbach. He then added that the primacy of matter strikes me as no different from mechanical materialism. For Marx, there is a priority of form, of social form, this is Jensen writing, rather than matter, and he defined mechanical materialism as primacy of matter, as in Democritus contra Aristotle. By contrast, Theo and Chris offered for mechanical materialism the definitions of matter determining everything instead of conditioning everything, Theo, and pejorative deterministic causality of matter, Chris. There is no simple choice as to which of these definitions is a more correct one. The problem is that the Marxist concept of materialism in different contexts seems to span both of these ideas, and furthermore, although they seem logically separable, at least to me, there is, I would argue, a strong belief in classical Marxism of their fundamental unity. As for the question of mechanical materialism, this is another of those highly vexing terms like dialectics that seems to have so many meanings that it's hard to disentangle them. Let me say, though, that here I tend to prefer Chris's definition, yet I question how useful the term mechanical materialism actually is. One should point out the importance of the word pejoratively in Chris's definition, because while in its Marxist use, the adjective mechanical attached to materialism is indeed pejorative and usually counterposed to dialectical, so that often mechanical, what applied to materialism, seems merely to mean not dialectical. Nevertheless, in its original formulation, like positivism, another term that is used in Marxism in a derogatory sense, the term mechanical philosophy was a chosen self-description and not at all a pejorative characterization originally. Furthermore, I would argue that this mechanical philosophy, in its original historical context, was also a great and necessary step in the intellectual emancipation of bourgeois society and the beginning of a conquest of the natural world that ultimately made possible both the wonders and horrors of capitalism, which could ultimately make possible socialism. It is worth remembering that, like machines themselves, mechanism has also at times played an emancipatory role. But in contrast with Jensen, I do not think that what people usually mean by mechanical materialism goes back to Democritus. Indeed, I think it could not, and that far from being an ancient philosophical problem, the struggle between materialism and idealism is actually a product of modern bourgeois society of the 17th and 18th centuries, and that modern materialism is as distinct from ancient materialism as modern democracy is from ancient democracy. And that from ancient democracy, and that modern materialism, unlike ancient materialism, can only be understood in the context of the scientific revolution. If there is then a twofold meaning of materialism in Marxism, what is its significance? I believe that both senses of materialism have been present in Marxism from its origins and in both Marx and Engels. And furthermore, perhaps quite problematically, that these two senses of materialism have been felt to be deeply linked. I'm very aware that this claim is not uncontroversial. And the idea that Marxism might in any way be committed to materialism and ontology and not merely as historical method has been vigorously rejected by many Marxists, particularly those associated with so-called Western Marxism, where it is often doxed. This complete rejection of what I am, for lack of a better term, calling ontological materialism lies behind Engelsism. Whatever in Marxism appears to support the interpretation of materialism, this ontological interpretation of materialism, is declared inauthentic and then blamed on Engels. Ontological materialism and its associations with natural science are stigmatized as positivism, mechanical materialism, and scientism, and furthermore simplistically associated with so-called Soviet Marxism. These terms of positivism and mechanical materialism, by the way, are somehow held by their users to be self-evident and then used with what to me often seems maddening imprecision and in sometimes contradictory ways. But against this rejection, there has been a rejection of the rejection, which then characterizes the non-material understanding of Marxism as idealist. On the one hand, then, we have a Marxism that is anthropocentric, that is concerned with sensuous human activity and agnostic about natural science. And then the other, we have a Marxism that is cosmological, and while certainly focused on the world of sensuous human activity, insists on the importance of situating that world of human beings in a vastly larger natural scientific picture of the world, a world that is ultimately indifferent to human beings. Thus, Engels in Dialectics of Nature, while fully confident of the victory of socialism, sketches out a vision of our ultimate fate as a species. Only conscious organization of social production, in which production and distribution are carried on in a planned way, can lift mankind above the rest of the animal world as regards the social aspect. In the same way that production in general has done this for men in their aspect as species, historical evolution makes such an organization daily more indispensable, but also with every day more possible. From it will date a new epoch of history in which mankind itself, and with mankind all branches of its activity, and especially natural science, will experience an advance that will put everything preceding it in the deepest shade. Nevertheless, all that comes into being deserves to perish. Millions of years may elapse, hundreds of thousands of generations be born and die, but inexorably the time will come when the declining warmth of the sun will no longer suffice to melt the ice thrusting itself forward from the poles. When the human race, crowded more and more about the equator, will finally no longer find even there enough heat for life, when gradually even the last trace of organic life will vanish, and the earth, an extinct frozen globe like the moon, will circle in deepest darkness and in an ever narrow orbit around the equally extinct sun and at last fall into it. Other planets will have preceded it, others will follow it. Instead of the bright, warm solar system with its harmonious arrangement of members, only a cold, dead sphere will still pursue its lonely path through universal space. And what will happen to our solar system will happen sooner or later to all the other systems of our island universe. It will happen to all the other innumerable island universes, even to those the light of which will never reach the eye, while there is a living human eye to receive it. Leaving aside, and Engels actually does not leave the story there because he believes that this spectacle of the heat death of the universe will reverse itself, and that's controversial. But leaving aside the specifics of Engels' cosmological predictions and their relationship to modern astrophysics and cosmology, what is striking here is the juxtaposition of, on the one hand, the triumph of human freedom via socialism, and on the other hand, the tragic sense of necessity that even this greatest accomplishment of humanity will succumb and go the way of the entire material universe. For a long time, this cosmological character of Engels' Marxism seemed antiquated and alienating, or at least quaint to many Marxists. And yet, more recently, it has ironically served to make Engels seem more relevant to some. Thus, for John Bellamy Foster, the emphasis of the place of human beings in nature and the dependence of human society on a non-human and pre-human natural reality is a virtue that makes it possible, in an inversion of the usual anti-Engelsism, to portray Engels not as a vulgar, positivist, mechanical materialist, but rather as the originator of eco-socialism. For John Bellamy Foster, what I'm calling its cosmological character makes Engels' Marxism superior and more in tune with the 21st century sensibility. He writes, Engels' ecological insights are inseparable from his inquiries into the dialectics of nature from which they arose. Yet the very first principle of what came to be known as the philosophical tradition of Western Marxism was that the dialectic could not be said to apply to external nature. That is, there was no such thing as what Engels referred to as so-called objective dialectics beyond the active realm of the human subject. Dialectical relations, even the objects of dialectical reasoning, were thus confined to the human historical sphere, where the identical subject-object could be said to apply, since all non-reflexive, transfactual reality outside of human consciousness and human action was excluded from the analysis. But with the complete rejection of the dialectics of nature within the Western Marxist tradition, the extraordinary power of Engels' explorations in this area, and the enormous influence they exerted on evolutionary and ecological thought within the natural sciences and on Marxism were lost, except to a relatively small number of left scientists and dialectical materialists. Unable to see dialectics as related to material nature, the Western Marxist philosophical tradition tended to relegate both natural science and external nature itself to the realm of mechanism and positivism. The result was to create a deep chasm between the dominant post-Second World War conception of Marxian philosophy in the West and natural science, and between Western Marxism and the materialist conception of nature, at the very moment, ironically, that the ecological movement was emerging as a major political force. In this view, the failure of what I've called an anthropocentric Marxism is then that it is too humanist in a bad sense and does not understand the need for a dialectical relationship between humans and the natural world, which in their view can only be supplied by a philosophy that sees dialectics as existing in nature and not just applicable to human society. Now, why in fact the responsible attitude towards the environment requires a dialectical attitude towards nature rather than just an overcoming of the destructive anarchy of capitalism is not entirely clear to me. And although I am in certain respects sympathetic to much of the spirit of John Bellamy Foster's defense of Engels, the letter of it leaves a lot to be desired. As an example of the peculiar places that the pro-Engels arguments can bring one, consider another article by John Bellamy Foster, co-written with Paul Burkhead, entitled Classical Marxism and the Second Law of Thermodynamics. The article is logically in two parts. The first part of the article is an attack on the, quote, myth, unquote, that Engels rejected the second law of thermodynamics. Their defense of Engels amounts to an attempt to distinguish between the applicability of the second law to closed systems and the thesis of the heat death of the universe, with Engels accepting the former but not the latter. This part of the article is precise and scholarly, locating Engels's views in the context of mid-19th century debates about the implications of the new science of thermodynamics. All of this is quite reasonable, although it does not address the philosophical question of Engels's a priori style of reasoning about natural law inherited from German idealism. In this case, the motivation for Engels's argument is clearly hostility to a potentially theistic conclusion hidden in mathematical abstraction. Then, however, the article goes beyond a perfectly rational defense of Engels as rejecting the second law to a much more problematic claim that thermodynamics is actually at the core of Marxism, and that Das Kapital itself needs to be read in this light. They even go on to claim the fact that Marx adopted the concept of labor power and used it both in its material energetic sense and in relationship to economic value analysis, i.e. the way labor power was translated into a commodity that generated value for the capitalist, has led such analysts as Robinbach and Wendling to refer to the marriage of Marx and Helmholtz in Marx's work, and in particular Engels. Robinbach points out that Marx always emphasized the energetic basis of labor power, and because labor involved mechanical work, Marx's confrontation with thermodynamics in his critique of political economy was such that it caused him to superimpose a thermodynamic model of labor over the ontological model of labor he inherits from Hegel. Well, this, to put it politely, is just crazy. To quote the great Richard Feynman in his lectures on physics, the physical word work is not the word in the ordinary sense of workers of the world unite, but is a different idea. While classical thermodynamics and Marxism were indeed contemporary developments which both represented tremendous intellectual achievements, and while Engels clearly and Marx perhaps somewhat less directly were quite aware of these great contemporary developments in physics, at most one can speak only of a parallel spirit. To go beyond this possibility of subtle intellectual parallels, and in the name of so-called materialism, to confuse labor considered as a physical process with labor considered as a social process is to misunderstand both Marxism and thermodynamics. There is no marriage of Marx and Helmholtz, and any attempt to arrange one is utterly misguided. It would be a mésalliance for both parties. Beyond the meanings of materialism and idealism in Marxism is the question of whether our understanding of them has any political significance. Again, the assumption of both camps tends to be that there is political significance. I, however, remain skeptical. I do not see that philosophically Stalinism, for example, flows necessarily from positivism or mechanical materialism. So even if one were to accept the anti-Engels judgment that philosophically he's a vulgar positivist, mechanical materialist, etc., the blame vulgarizing Engels for Stalinism argument seems to me absurd. The tragedy of Marxism in the 20th century needs to be understood as the result of contingent political failures and not as the failure of philosophy. This is difficult for philosophically minded people to accept, that thinking correctly about Marxism's philosophical foundations is probably of secondary or perhaps even tertiary political importance. We do desperately need to get Marxism right, but we need to do so without first being able to get right questions like materialism and idealism. So I've so far been talking about the argument about dialectics of nature within Marxism and how it seems to me connected to two different conceptions of materialism that have coexisted within Marxism, and whose separability itself is a matter of intense disagreement within Marxism. But let me now try to talk briefly about the book Dialectics of Nature itself. Here, because I'm assuming that most of you have not read the book, I may sound a bit like a book report. Dialectics of Nature in its present form consists of 10 chapters. The first, 9th, and 10th chapters can be read separately and are probably to the general reader the most interesting. The first chapter is a splendid summary of the history of science from the 16th century to Engels' time, rooted in the assumption that this is an integral part of the rise of bourgeois society and a great force for human intellectual emancipation. The 9th chapter is an interesting essay, quite famous, on the part played by labor in the transition from ape to man, in which labor is portrayed as what made humans human. Because for Engels, the dialectics of nature embraces as much the human impact on the natural world as that of the natural world on us. Nature has made us, but we have also made nature. The 10th chapter is a debunking of the popular craze for mediums and seances of the late 19th century. These 3 chapters can be read separately. In fact, I believe they were published separately in the 1890s from the rest of the book and do not require much knowledge at least, of 19th century science. The 8th chapter treats a quite specific topic, tidal friction, Kant and Thomson, Tate on the rotation of the Earth and lunar attraction. The rest of the book consists of sometimes technical but also wide-ranging discussions of topics in contemporary natural science, including physics, chemistry, and biology. In all of the specifics, the guiding thread is the idea that the empirical discoveries of natural science confirm dialectics. Despite a self-understood materialism against Hegel's idealism, the underlying model is Hegel's philosophy of nature. It is, of course, one of the accusations against Engels by some, but not all of the anti-Engels crowd, that he had a botched understanding of Hegel as well as of Marx. I do not find this claim at all convincing, and it seems rather that Engels had the same combination of continuity and discontinuity with Hegel that Marx did. In this respect, I accept the self-understanding of both Marx and Engels. There are several difficulties the general reader is likely to encounter with much of Dialectics of Nature. It is incomplete and often has a fragmented character. I've read it in English, but it's apparently written in a kind of macaronic style, often mixing languages. Much of it requires a scientific background, but the science itself is that of a century and a half ago. Even to a scientifically literate reader, this can require translation. Engels at times also seems to misunderstand the technical details. Even Haldane, for example, admits that Engels almost certainly got it wrong in the chapter Untitled Friction. Dialectics of Nature was written mostly from 1872 to 1883, but was not published until 1925, long after Engels' death. The literary executor was Edward Bernstein, whom one should remember was a protege of Hegel before becoming the great revisionist heretic, who sent it to Albert Einstein, who was apparently not impressed by the treatment of physics, but nevertheless recommended publication because he thought it of historical interest. If anybody knows more about that, I would be greatly fascinated by learning more about what Einstein thought of dialectics of nature. Writing in the 1870s, Engels was able to experience and meditate on the profound revolution of natural science that occurred in the middle of the 19th century. Indeed, one might say that it was only in the lifetime of Marx and Engels that the transformation from natural philosophy to science was completed, and an intellectual outline of the basic disciplines and picture of the physical world that underlies the present scientific world picture was completed. Nevertheless, Engels, of course, missed the revolutions of 20th century science. Thus, Engels, like Marx, was an enthusiastic Darwinian, and although as an ardent materialist, he would no doubt have eagerly welcomed the great achievements of molecular biology, he lived in a pre-DNA world. Even more significantly, his physics is definitely classical. Indeed, it represents the peak of classical physics before the great revolutions of the first third of the 20th century. If 1895, the year of Engels' death, could be seen as the year of the beginning of the revolution in physics. His space was Euclidean. He knew nothing of nuclear energy. He assumed, as did the science of his time, that the source of the sun's energy was gravitational collapse. The structure of the atom and the true origin of the nature of chemical bonds were unknown to him. The cell doctrine of Schleiden and Schwann was established science, but most of what we know about the details of the internal machinery of cells could not be known until electron microscopes were invented, and so forth. These limitations are not, of course, Engels, but those of the science of his time. But let us focus now rather on what the science of Engels' time did know. If one were to try to sum it up in one big idea, I would say, and Engels himself is intensely aware of it, it is that nature is not static but dynamic. Of the 18th century, Engels says, for the natural scientists of that period, nature was something ossified, something immutable, and for most of them, something that had been created at one stroke. Science was still deeply enmeshed in theology. Everywhere it thought and found its ultimate resort in an impulse from outside that was not to be explained from nature itself. But parallel to the transformation of society in the 19th century, a new relationship of science to time began to dawn. The universe not only is, it has become and is still becoming. That insight is the real kernel, I believe, of what Engels means by dialectics in the phrase dialectics of nature. Newton had only accounted for the present motions of the planets and did so splendidly that Pope could explain, nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, let Newton be, and all was light. But what if one wanted to go further than this light in an age of enlightenment, after all, and to ask, why was there a solar system after all? As far as Newton was concerned, God had just set it up at the beginning of time and started it going. But then with the Kant-Laplace hypothesis, the solar system itself became not a miracle, but a development out of a pre-existing natural order based upon applying Newton's own laws. Linnaeus in the 18th century could classify the entire hierarchy of the living world, but natural history remained ahistorical. Monboddo could speculate philosophically about the similarities between orangutans and human beings, and Rousseau could speak about a state of nature. But in the 19th century, the beginnings of the modern outline of human evolution started to be drawn. The old opposition between an ahistorical and eternal nature and the historical world of human beings was collapsing. In its place was a view of human history as a small but highly significant part, at least for us, of a long chain of events in the evolution of the material universe was coming into view. If one accepts, as Haldane does, a tantalizing hint that Engels, contrary to the dominant science of his time, believed in the transmutation of elements, then one can only imagine how much pleasure he would have derived from the 20th century's discovery of nuclear synthesis. Even the elements themselves have a history. On the one hand, this is a technical triumph of astrophysics. On the other hand, it is an overturning of a 2,500-year way of thinking. If the historicity of nature was a revolutionary realization, then there were nevertheless some fundamental tensions in the worldview of Victorian science and how it judged this historicity. And these, in some respects, mirrored tensions in bourgeois society itself. Were things changing for better or worse? Thus, on the one hand, the theory of evolution offered a progressive vision of life, moving towards ever greater complexity, culminating in human beings going on to an ever greater control of nature. But thermodynamics seemed to suggest ultimately a dark, cold future for the universe that was steadily running down. In thermodynamics itself, however, a tension also existed between a principle of conservation of matter and of energy and a tendency of entropy to steadily increase. Engels' struggles with the second law of its thermodynamics have been noted, mocked, and defended. I will not say anything more about it now. What is more striking to me is his tendency to interpret physical principles in metaphysical terms, a problematic legacy of German idealism. Fundamental conservation laws seem to him always to be interpreted as having an a priori character and thus in principle logically deducible rather than merely empirically verifiable. Thus, the conservation of matter, which Engels treats as a fundamental principle of materialism, is clearly empirically false, a fact that is certainly of both considerable philosophical but also practical significance. There's sunlight, for example, in this room, and there are thousands of nuclear weapons on the planet. In general, Engels seems to me handicapped by his physics, or rather metaphysics, that seeks to ultimately resolve all physical phenomena to matter in motion, the inadequacy of such a concept of physical reality would become manifest in the 20th century. Thus, to the two aforementioned revolutions in 19th century natural science must be added another, the discovery of the electromagnetic field. A new type of physical entity had been summoned into existence. The full philosophical significance of this would not become apparent until the 20th century, when the theory of relativity would dismantle the physical ether theories of Engels and Maxwell's time, and in turn bring up fundamental philosophical questions about space and time. Furthermore, the tension between particles and fields as ultimate representations of reality would manifest itself in the famous wave-particle duality of quantum mechanics and in the continuing, ever more awkward ontology of modern physics. So what then is my judgment of this admittedly problematic book? Certainly, I am not in the anti-Engels camp. Indeed, the most extreme versions of anti-Engels seem to me not only absurd, but intellectually dishonest. I also cannot, however, endorse the hagiographical approach, either in its traditional versions, both Stalinist and Trotskyist, nor the new postmodern eco-socialist version. Engels got himself into a lot of trouble by casually suggesting that Engels had erred. Lukács got himself into a lot of trouble by casually suggesting that Engels had erred by ascribing dialectics to nature. If so, however, then one must, I think, also ascribe the same error to Hegel, since I do not see how one can find Hegel's philosophy of nature intellectually acceptable, but not Engels's dialectics of nature. Lukács at least recognizes this relationship when he says, the misunderstanding which arises from Engels's presentation of dialectics rests essentially on the fact that Engels, following Hegel's false example, that's Lukács's phrase, extends the dialectical method also to the knowledge of nature. Speaking for myself, I'm not sure if the question, does dialectics apply to nature, has any clear meaning. Dialectics is a term that has had so many meanings over such a long history. The evidence that it's not always clear what anyone means by it. The evidence from a now antiquated natural science presented by Engels for his thesis also seemed unlikely to convince anyone not already convinced. But again, the real question would be, of what exactly is one being convinced? The famous so-called laws of dialectics, which are supposedly abstracted from the history of nature and human society, such as the transformation of quantity into quality and vice versa, the interpenetration of opposites, and the law of the negation of the negation, for example, seem to me almost vacuous in their vagueness. At most, they could have a heuristic or poetic value. They do not even seem to me to rise to the threshold of possibly being false. Although by saying this, I have no doubt convicted myself of empiricist and positivist Philistinism in the eyes of many of you. Nevertheless, I do not think that Dialectics of Nature is either a trivial or unimportant book. It was clearly an effort that was respected by both Engels himself and Marx. It is a book, therefore, that has, at least for me, a considerable interest simply as the document of one of the co-founders of Marxism, contemplating not without a considerable degree of scientific literacy, the science of the 19th century. Rereading it again after many years in preparation for this teaching, I found it far more interesting than I had remembered, and I found myself being far more generous to it than I had expected to be. In talking about it, I have therefore tried to steer a course between a genuine respect for Engels and a false piety that ignores serious flaws. The mere fact also that it has been so controversial within Marxism, with both intense critics and intense defenders, ought to make it of interest to anyone concerned with the philosophical foundations of Marxism. Finally, I would like to urge, in connection with this bicentennial of his birth, a renewed appreciation of the role of Engels as a co-founder of Marxism. Winston Churchill once referred to Clement Attlee as a modest man with much to be modest about. Engels was a modest man, at least with respect to Marx, although, like Marx, he did not suffer fools gladly, with much not to be modest about. Even though he was always glad to play second fiddle to such a splendid first fiddle as Marx, we should not let this obscure the central role he played in what was for many years the party of two. Marxism would not have been Marxism without Engels. But I've spoken long enough. Let's open it up now to questions and discussions.
Great, Richard. Thank you very much. That was great. We've already got one question in the Q&A from Jensen, and we've just before that had a question from Andoni in the chat. I would prefer to call on them to speak their questions, but I'm gonna start off myself with a question, which actually doesn't address really the meat of your presentation, but rather addresses, you just finished by talking about Engels as one of a party of two, but certainly from the mid 1870s onwards, and then more importantly after Marx's death, Engels was part of a party of soon to be many hundreds of thousands and then millions,
Right.
namely the Second International.
And a very profound.
Engels wrote several works which had the audience in mind of the Second International, and were, I'm thinking of things like Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. And so I wanted to ask you to say something about who you think he was writing the Dialectics of Nature for, and how that might relate to those other kind of, the Second International as his audience or not.
Well, he was taking time off from Dialectics of Nature, among other things, to write Anti-During. So Anti-During was published, was like a popular work. I think two things. One is, unlike a work like, Materialism, Theory of Relativity, there's a direct political context to it. There was no direct political context. I think he was writing this in large part for himself. I think that, from very early on, from the 1850s, he had this deep interest in natural science. And he also had this Hegelian background and this philosophical background. And I think that the philosophical question of nature and how one conceived the relationship of human society to nature and Marxism was one that preoccupied him. I mean, I'm sure that if he had time and he could have worked on it, it would have been published, and it would have been intended for, I don't know, maybe, a kind of philosophically and scientifically literate audience that was sympathetic to Marxism. I don't know.
Okay, thanks. And Andoni, I'm going to unmute you. Oh yeah, go on. Do you want to say something else?
Well, I was just saying something about this party of two. So yes, of course, Engels played a role on his own in the last 12 years of his life, and he also played a big political role even when Marx was alive, often. And that's very significant, and I'm not minimizing that. But I was trying to emphasize the particular dynamics of the Marx-Engels relationship, because Engels is seen as this sidekick. It's the sidekick role. So I have a peculiar literary analogy that just sort of popped into my mind. So one of the things, as some of you know, is that I've been rereading Don Quixote, and I just finished. And one of the things that struck me about the novel this time, reading it, is that even though it's Don Quixote, that Sancho Panza is as vital a character and is central to the novel and the story as Don Quixote. And I have a sort of sense of Engels is the sidekick. He plays second fiddle. He does this voluntarily. He speaks of Marx as a genius. But contrary to the anti-Engelsism, I feel that Engels played a vital and central role in the development of Marxism, and that he was a necessary part of the development of Marxism. And I think Marx recognized that.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to unmute Andoni now.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go for it.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Richard. That was great. And I actually did, before the teach-in, I listened to a very bad robotic reading of Dialectic of Nature. So it was fascinating, and I have the same response in terms of its specificity to the science of the 19th century. Like, it's really in detail. But I want to pick up on something that Ephraim raised, specifically in terms of its reception politically, because as you point out, the English edition's introduction is penned by a scientist who's in the Stalinist period, a British scientist.
A great scientist who was also a fanatical.
Yeah, no, really influential, and he leads in the New Left as well. Like, there's a whole range of New Left evolutionary biologist Marxists who come later and who play a role in the 1970s kind of battles with sociobiology. And so there's kind of like, there's Engels writing for this, the Second International, and then there's figures like Haldane writing, sort of bringing this work up again for the Third International, and then there are the New Left biologists who bring it up again. And I just want to, what you think of those different receptions and why they're trying to, are they the same attempt to forge a connection between the science of society and nature, or are they, do you detect like a difference in terms of what they're trying to do with this work?
Well, I think there's a different political context and there's a different kind of cultural attitude towards science. So I think that, okay, so, well, I'm was going to go back and say something about the actual publication history. But so I think there's a, particularly since the New Left, there's been an ambivalence towards science on the left. I mean, now we live, in 2020, we live in this odd period where saying you believe in science is also connected to like saying you're a Democrat, right? In a particular context about certain things. But I think that for a long time, and particularly starting with the New Left, there was actually a kind of skepticism about science and scientism. So the New Left, unlike the Old Left, tended to have at least an ambivalence towards science. There's none of that ambivalence in Marx and Engels. I mean, there's a clear, overwhelming respect for natural science. Maybe there is some of that ambivalence in Lukács, I'm not sure. I think that the problem that is posed, right, that there's a kind of perennial problem that manifests itself in different ways about, maybe it goes back to the Greeks, physis and nomos. It's like the question of society and nature, right? Again, we speak about nature as though nature is just something that is there. I mean, the category of nature is also, this is part of my point about materialism. The modern is really a modern category. You could in some way say nature really was invented in the 18th century in terms of the way we now conceive it. I mean, I was also going to say that in terms of the publication history, I mean, Engels is writing at the time of the Second International, but these are not for the Second International literally. I mean, He did popular works. So this was published, it's a complicated history because it was published in Russian. This guy Timorazayev like bought the manuscript from Engels, but the Marx Engels Institute. Anyway,
I guess
with
the New Left, I agree that there's a way in which like the New Left science, there's an underlying skepticism to science. Way that they'll, and I would even lump someone like Stephen Jay Gould in this milieu, although he's not a committed Marxist like Richard Lewontin. But
it's also the difference, by the way, also the question of biology, right? I mean, the appeal of quote dialectical materialism to biology and quote dialectical thinking has clearly been greater than its appeal and clearly less problematic than to physics.
Mm-hmm. And one might even say that it's had contributions. Like these aren't marginal scientists. These are scientists in their own right who are also Marxists.
Yeah, I mean, again, the question is what you mean by these terms, right? I mean, you could say the same thing about Naturphilosophie in the 19th century. I mean, it's not as though it was a completely sterile phenomenon. But again, the question is like I think you have to separate the categories of philosophical truth from heuristic value, right? But sort of like, I don't know what the, whether one can therefore agree with something because some way of thinking has proved useful. I mean, in that sense, I would say, by the way, about like my point about mechanism, right? I mean, mechanism in its original sense has clearly been abandoned by science. I mean, by the science that it originated in physics. But it proved tremendously useful heuristically in terms of thinking about nature and tremendously liberating, right? Which is different from the use of mechanical materialism pejoratively, which I think is just a term used to stigmatize what is seen as non-dialectical materialism. But I'm just saying that within simply a framework of an evolution of natural science, there are many ideas that help science progress, right? And that are helpful to scientists in thinking about science that you don't necessarily want to attribute like
underlying process.
Right.
So if I could just, one last thing I wanted to ask is, like, often I've heard you disagree on, Chris will say, well, actually, science is, our ability to know the world is bound up with society, and it's possible that, the horizons of science in a very kind of qualitative way could be transformed with transformations in society. And when I read, Dialectic of Nature, it almost has that kind of a theme to it. There's a way in which, like, being able to separate out history in natural history, those processes, those geological processes, and give them an independence is a real kind of key factor, and it's bound up with transformations in society. And I'm wondering how do I misunderstand that debate between you and Chris?
I think so. I mean, I'm not sure what you're attributing to me here. I mean, again, I think that the tension that I outlined between the two materialisms, although I'm not particularly defending materialism ontologically at all, quite the contrary. But I mean, that in part of what I'm sympathetic to in Engels actually is this kind of causal vision. And I also think that Engels has, what you would describe as a realist philosophy of science, not a social constructionist philosophy. He's definitely on the realist end, which is also an aspect of sort of the new left intellectually, that it tended to move away from scientific realism towards social constructionism in terms of philosophy of science.
All right, I'm going to jump in there to bring in another question. At the moment, I've got Jensen, then Kevin, Tom, and Teo. So let me find Jensen on the thing to unmute. Here we go. Okay, Jensen, can you
hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's great. Thanks.
So I can see a face.
Thanks, Richard. That was really good. I have one just sort of clarificatory point, and then one or two questions related to that. Just the first point of clarification is that, yeah, I absolutely agree with you that there's a major difference between modern and ancient materialism, and I certainly wouldn't want to say that what's happening in Newton and what's happening in Democritus, that these are the same conceptions of materialism. I would agree that the sort of modern scientific revolution is absolutely key. I mean, the conception of nature is governed by law rather than being a cyclical process in which things have principles, internal to themselves. I mean, that's a key, distinction. However, what I would want to emphasize is that, I mean, Aristotle's original critique of Democritus, in which he asserts the primacy of form over matter, and is criticizing, what he sees as a reductive materialism in Democritus. I mean, I still think that that's deeply relevant to the issue of, mechanism versus teleology, which is also, what I take to be the relevant sense in which mechanism is still very much informing, contemporary biology and contemporary science more generally. So I wondered about exactly what you meant by the abandonment of mechanism, since it's clear that sort of an Aristotelian teleological conception of inner purposes or living organisms, that's far more an exceptional way of thinking about things. And also, I think that distinction, as I've argued on the list and elsewhere, the distinction between teleology and mechanism, it's deeply important for Hegel and for Marxism. So that's one part of it. And then the other, I guess, question is, at one point you said something like, that the negation of the negation, the notion of the dialectic, it's vague and sort of indeterminate, and maybe isn't so useful, or is maybe just more a poetic device. But if one is going to hold that sort of position with respect to the philosophy of nature, then why not just go all the way and say that that's true of history too, and that we should just throw out that entire vocabulary? I disagree with you that it is actually so vague. I think that Hegel is quite precise about what this means, and that Marx is quite precise in his way of employing it. I think it's a bit of hand wavy to say that, oh, this is poetic and vague, et cetera, et cetera. They're pretty rigorous in the way that they're using these terms. And then just the last thing is that, I was just thinking about, I thought Ephraim's question about audience was really important, but it also seems to me that Dialectics of Nature is an attempt to further elaborate the continuity between natural history and history for Marxism, or internal to Marxism. So, this is sort of important to the self-clarification on the part of Marxism as a project, as to how it understands this relationship between history and nature. So in that sense, it doesn't seem to be just sort of like a diversion or a secondary activity, but deeply essential to Marxism that someone take up that question and actually try to answer it, how history and natural history relate. So
okay, on the last point, I agree. And what I meant just by a diversion is just in terms of Engels' own busy life.
okay.
This was something he had to, this was what he was writing in his spare time when he was doing other work. The point about teleology and mechanism, I don't think that those are as simple exclusive alternatives. And I think that the category of mechanism philosophically needs to be fleshed out. I think that here, and again, the arguments about teleology and Aristotelianism apply almost exclusively to biology. The point about mechanism also applies very profoundly to physics. And I don't think that one could really describe modern physics as mechanist in the way that one could describe 17th
Sure.
and 18th century physics. And I think that those are the most profound ontological differences. The point about Hegel and dialectics and whether something means something, like if you say, well, dialectics of nature, something like the interpenetration of opposites, right, as a law of dialectics. Okay, so is the wave-particle duality proof of that? Somebody might say yes. I don't know. I don't even know what that means. In other words, I feel like all of these laws, the principles, can be applied so generally. And I feel that's done by both Engels and Hegel, right? Here I'm not sympathetic to, or for that matter, Marx in some of his writings, or Trotsky, a lot of people. So I'm not sympathetic to that. It doesn't seem to me that there's a criterion by which one could judge whether such a principle was true or false. A principle like the conservation of energy or the, quote, laws of nature in ordinary sense, one can clearly see what it would mean for them to be false. I can't really see what it would mean for these, quote, laws of dialectics to be false. So they seem kind of.
Well, I would question the phrase law of dialectics, though. I think that's already, quite far from how Hegel is thinking about,
Well,
it's like he lays out anywhere what the laws of dialectics are. That's it's a method rather than a set of principles.
Okay, so to go back to so the question about Hegel is actually a very important one in context with this book, okay? And contrary to the people who think that Engels didn't understand Hegel, I think the opposite is the case. I think that Engels was profoundly influenced by Hegel. You see that in every page. I think that also the question is the way one talks about this also depends to some extent what particular scientific field one is talking about, right? I think that the way one discusses this question is different if one is talking about biology from the way one would talk about it if one is talking about physics. I mean, I didn't address the question of mathematics, which is an interesting topic. You know, Marx and Engels, both Marx and Engels, have passages where they clearly argue that the apparent paradoxes of the calculus can only be resolved by a kind of dialectical logic. I think that's just wrong. I think that what their writings on mathematics show is that they were actually remarkably ignorant of contemporary developments in mathematics that were of fundamental philosophical significance in ways that they were not about contemporary developments in physics or biology. But,
Sure.
Okay, Jensen, did you want to add something else, or should I bring in the next speaker?
No, I think that's fine. Move on.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. Okay, next I'm gonna unmute Kevin. Kevin, you can
hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, first of all, thanks very much, Richard, for this teaching. It's excellent. I guess in the vein of Jensen, I also have a comment and then maybe two questions. So the comment is, I was recently talking with an older Trotskyist I know, and he said he himself was interested in the question of Engels on nature when he was younger, in a way he might not be today. And so before he was deciding to join the what's the organization? Yeah, the Young Socialist Alliance in, I think, 1966. He had
the group of the American SWP.
Yes, and he had a question for the woman who was assigned to recruit him, and which was he wanted to know if the Trotskyists believed that the brain was quote unquote thinking matter, end quote, which is to say whether, you know, they were adherents of a strict sort of materialist view of nature, and so they were. And so this older Trotskyist I know decided to join. And of course, he like post-faced that by saying, let it be known that the main radicalizing influence in the 1960s was, you know, the Cuban Revolution and of course, the Vietnam War. So I guess that's the anecdote that came to mind. I guess two questions. So the first question has to maybe do with what I would call the supernatural faith, with supernatural faith. So, you know, Engels and also Lenin, right? They sort of really believe this sort of framework of classical physics, which is ruled out, you know, with the 1925 around that time birth of quantum mechanics. And so, in fact, you know, someone was telling me that most people recently, that most people who have trouble with quantum mechanics have the same reasons as Marx, you know, et cetera, had, you know, that the basic principles really do work within the framework of the quote unquote idealist philosophers of the 19th century that the quote unquote materialists like Marx hated, right? The, you know, information or the quote unquote mind has to be at the top, right? That's how quantum mechanics works. You know, however, you know, Lenin, right, like, you know, also has these sort of things within classical physics, right? He has this sort of principle of the inexhaustibility of matter, right? Matter is kind of like a Matryoshka doll, he claims, right? And electrons, a galaxy, which had tiny electrons in it, which were galaxies again, and those had many, many electrons, and so on indefinitely, right? And this sort of like Matryoshka picture, but almost certainly, you know, it's almost certainly impossible because distances shorter than the Planck scale don't exist, right? And so therefore, maybe it's an open question whether or not Marx and Engels would have been able to understand relativity for that matter, right? Same with Lenin. And so they weren't really physicists. And so that poses the question of like the idea that they would be compatible with the sort of with the cutting edge 20th century science. It's a question of a matter of supernatural faith, right? But then that poses the question of platypus, right? Where the question of of revolution after its failure, and even just the revolution in general, the world revolution is also a question of supernatural faith as well. And so I guess then the real question is, in the failure of the sort of world revolution 1917 through 1919, has like, is it just simply not possible anymore to render the sort of two perspectives compatible? I guess that might be the first question. I guess I can just leave out the first question for now.
I'm not sure I quite understand. I mean, I don't see the argument about supernatural faiths. I mean, if anything, a classical physicist, the supreme classical physicist like Newton, was profoundly theistic, right? And his explanation of the order of the universe was theistic. God set it up this way. The laws of nature emerge from God's will.
No, sorry, I mean what the sort of the idea that Marx, sort of Engels and Lenin would be compatible with the cutting edge 20th century. It's a matter of supernatural faith today.
So, like, I mean, at least one of those there's actually, you can actually empirically discuss, namely the theory of relativity. And Lenin lived until more 24, but he was not great shape. So, that was definitely an issue discussed in the Soviet Union. And I think Lenin said something like, you could use Einstein's calculations without accepting Machian philosophy. I don't really know, but I mean, I'm not, definitely in the Soviet Union in the 20s, like a sense of a contradiction between certain aspects of modern physics and dialectical materialism as understood was definitely the fore. And there's also a sense that people often have that this is a product of a party dictatorship imposing thinking on people. And that's actually simplistic, because actually there was considerable open philosophical debate in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. Not all of it crude, but which was inspired by Marxism, and inspired by Marxism in many different ways that mirrored kind of similar tensions in the West. So I don't know.
Do you think there's a missed opportunity to render them compatible with the sort of failure of the revolution 17 through 19?
I mean, it's hard to say, because you're talking about a book. We're talking about a book here that is from the 1870s, basically, right? So we're talking about a book that the contemporary science of Engels's time that we're actually talking about here is that of a Maxwell, not of an Einstein, right? Einstein is just being born while this manuscript is being prepared. And the problem is, I would say, the metaphysical assumptions. The technical problems arise from the metaphysical assumptions. Again, this desire to understand things as matter and motion, the particular way materialism is understood. So there's to go back, there's a kind of twofold character to the scientific revolution. And this kind of piggybacks on Jensen's point. So on the one hand, the scientific revolution, it's certainly a revolt against Aristotle. And Aristotle has to be overthrown for modern science to progress. Now, in other fields, in social fields and biology, maybe the revolt against Aristotle went too far. It's a more complicated question. But certainly in the realm of physics, Aristotle had to be overthrown. Part of that revolt against Aristotle is inspired by ancient materialism, Democritus, and Karl Marx, by the way, would disagree, and Engels, with my point about the difference between ancient and modern materialism, I think, because I think that they tend to see modern materialism as a lineal descendant of ancient materialism. That's one part of the scientific revolution. But another part of the scientific revolution is paradoxically quite Platonic. It has to do with the role of number, or Platonic Pythagorean. And I think that other aspect of the mathematization of nature, not just the atomization of nature, not the materialization, is actually, at least in physics, the part that has become more dominant. So, if you go back to the time of, and this is the complicated thing, you go back to Engels's time, the original models that Maxwell has of the ether are these quasi-mechanical models, right? That Maxwell half believes in, half doesn't, right? For us in the 21st century or the 20th century, an electromagnetic field or any field becomes a kind of mathematical abstraction. So there's a kind of dematerialization within the most materialist of sciences that is steadily happening from the mid-19th century on. It seems to me that classical Marxism didn't, for other ideological reasons, didn't quite grasp that. And again, I'm really not sure of what the significance of that is ultimately. It's something that I've long been aware of and long struggled with. And I feel like I need to point it out. I mean, one of the things that I'm aware of when talking about this book is how most of the conversation about the book tends to be focused on a very abstract philosophical plane, right? It's dialectics apply to nature or they don't apply to nature. It's about dialectics, right? The specific engagement of Engels with natural science and the relationship of the philosophy to the natural science tends to be ignored, is my sense. Okay.
But my question was about the failure of the revolution. Did it render this sort of stuff like incompatible in some sort of way?
I mean, you know, I once heard an interpretation that that the Copenhagen interpretation, a lot of these like standard interpretations that were dismissed as idealist by many Marxists of quantum mechanics, were a result of sort of a kind of right-wing thought. I don't know. I tend to be suspicious of that. I don't think that there is definitely a complicated relationship between social developments and the progress of science. There is a relationship between the French Revolution and certain types of, but it's not that literal. It's not like, oh, this is the failure of the revolution. Natural science progressed in the 20th century, even while social thought regressed, and they can be separated. I don't know, for example, to what extent, the kind of crisis in the ontology of physics or the sense of dissatisfaction, that you often encounter among theoretical physicists about the foundations, about string theory, loop quantum gravity, things like that. Is that to some extent, is that somehow a subtle manifestation of some kind of social crisis manifested in the most abstract thinking? It could be, or it could be something else. It's very hard to understand the exact relationship between social history and science usually. Now, there are exceptions. So classical thermodynamics, which we were discussing, is absolutely and definitely a product of industrial capitalism. It's the Industrial Revolution and the development of the steam engine and thinking about steam engines in the most abstract mathematical sense that led to the development of classical thermodynamics. There's a direct connection, but that connection doesn't always exist. Sometimes it's more subtle.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm going to now bring in Tom Cannell, who's next. Tom, if you unmute yourself, you can speak.
Cool, thank you. Richard actually already addressed the first of my two questions, which was, is there an important difference between ancient and modern ontological materialism with respect to mathematics? And I think that there really is a really crucial difference there. And I think Richard was showing why that is. I wonder whether that means that modern materialism is incompatible with dialectics in a way that ancient materialism was not. That the sort of Epicurus and Lucretius and all basically denied the sort of the Stoic idea of of a logos existing and also sort of mathematical truths, abstract mathematical truths existing above and beyond concrete reality. and it has been an integral part of modern science and modern physics, in particular, to actually recognize the centrality of the mathematical to its understanding of the material world. So while Copenhagen interpreters of quantum mechanics might disagree with multiple world interpreters of quantum mechanics, they all agree on the mathematics as being central. And the thing about mathematics is that one thing that mathematics cannot tolerate is contradiction. And contradiction is at the center of dialectics, as I understand it. And therefore, there's a way in which modern materialism just can't jibe with dialectics. And that may not have been true of ancient materialism, but materialism has changed and become something different.
Well, I wouldn't say that mathematics can't tolerate contradiction. I think that contradiction means something different in the context of mathematics. A contradiction in mathematics refers to propositions. Contradiction in Marxism can refer to what would otherwise be called opposing tendencies. Again, it's the way that words are used. I don't think it's like some fundamental logical difference.
I think that there is a difference between the class struggle is not a contradiction in capitalism. It's sort of opposing forces. What is the contradiction in capitalism is the private collective production and private appropriation, allegedly. So I mean, I think there's a difference between conflict and opposition, which non-dialectical thinking can basically make lots and lots of sense of. I mean, sort of, Newton recognized that for every action there was an equal and opposite reaction. So Newton had no trouble of thinking through the opposition of forces, but the internal contradiction.
Well, Marx and Engels use the example of elliptical motion as contradiction in that specific case, which I think is kind of.
Sorry, what is it? What is the example?
Elliptical motion. I think I would just say it's vector addition, but this is my maybe insufficient Hegelian. I mean, on the subject of Hegelianism in mathematics, or I mean, I have read or looked at the Marx's mathematical manuscripts, and again, I'm not impressed by them. I'm not impressed by generally the philosophical approach. It seems to me that actually what was needed in the calculus, which is most of what they deal with, was an improved formal logic. Now, people have said that one of the consequences of those manuscripts is that it stimulated the study of non-standard analysis in China, which is a good thing, I suppose, because I like non-standard analysis. But again, that it seems to me the real development of non-standard analysis and real infinitesimals is a result of formal logic, of set theory. I'm not, but to the basic point, like about, is there a contradiction between a mathematically determinate materialism and Hegelianism or dialectics? At least as far as Engels is concerned, the answer is no. Right? Your basic thesis would be one that he would reject. I don't find it convincing that there's some fundamental tension there. I think that there are ways in which the Hegelian tradition tended to downplay, more than the Kantian, by the way, in the importance of mathematics specifically to natural science, emphasized a conceptual understanding rather than a formal mathematical one. I mean, by the way, one of the things that annoyed me about the book is, of course, that Engels, like Marx, follows Hegel in his anti-Newtonianism. But this is a minor point and very obscure at this point.
Okay, thanks, Tom. I've next got Theo and then Spencer. So Theo, you can unmute yourself and speak.
Thanks, Ephraim. I, of course, agree with Richard's assertion that Marxism will be justified politically first of all, but it is also evident from this book and from other activities that Marx, Engels, Lenin were interested in ideological battles.
And philosophy. They were.
Philosophy. And it was not an ideological hobby. And I want to say that they were seeing some necessity in the link of the ideological battle and the political battle. And I wanted to pursue this a bit further because even in Platypus, sometimes people are frustrated with intellectual issues or the relationship of Marx and Hegel, and they always emphasize, let's do the work. But Engels' concerns here seems to contradict that. And he was searching for this extremely general, far-reaching, important general laws. And I would like to ask you to try to pursue or explain a bit better, as you see it, why he was thinking that this is important. It's not an ideological hobby or something like that. You already said that. So what they were thinking, what's the necessary link between this battle and the battle of politics?
Okay, so first of all, I'm not sure, speaking for myself, that there is a necessary link. I tend to doubt that. Like, I tend to doubt that the question, does dialectics exist in nature, has any real political significance. Philosophically, and as human beings who exist in a material world, I think it's a very profound and interesting question. So I think there are lots of questions that are of great interest that are not of particularly great political significance. So I don't feel that one should only have to justify philosophical questions by saying that they're of political significance for Marxists.
But don't you claim the truth from opposing antagonistic socialists? They were claiming that they were serving truth, the truth of society, and that Marxism is not just one among them, tendencies, and let's see if we will win at the end. They were thinking that they follow the truth of society in its relation to nature, for example. Does this have any meaning, or they were just,
it has a meaning
intellectually?
No, but I don't see those as the only alternatives. I mean, to say that something has a meaning, or that something is worthwhile pursuing, or that a question is important, is different from saying that it has a direct political significance. Again, unlike Materialism and Empiricism, there was no direct political motive for writing this book. I think that the questions raised were questions that Engels himself personally felt as important and interesting, and Marx also, and that they were questions that they thought that other people would think about. And Engels grew up in a very pietist religious background, and he broke with that, right? And I'm not saying that Marxism is a religion, but I think that the kind of cosmological questions, right, that religion addresses were questions that certainly pursued Engels throughout his life, that he cared about, that he cared about not just thinking about immediate political struggles, but what is the place of humanity in the universe? It's like, of course, like the famous Kant line about the two things that fill me with never ceasing wonder, the moral law within me and the starry sky above me. I think that Engels felt that awe, right, at the starry sky, at nature, at the cosmos, at matter, and he lived at a time when it seemed that great revolutions were happening in terms of human understanding of nature that were, he felt, profoundly liberating, and he wanted to combine them. So you don't have to go as far as to speak about a marriage of Helmholtz and Marx to say that somebody like Engels definitely read Helmholtz, and that mattered, and not mattered in some direct political sense, but it mattered in terms of like thinking about the world. Engels was also a polymath. He had he knew he could read a dozen languages. He had wide-ranging interests, natural science, military history, so I think that this fit in with his general sentiment. One of the questions I often thought about while rereading the book is, can one imagine any Marxist today trying to do something like this. And I thought, no, you couldn't. That's part of the charm of the book, right?
Rich, I want to bring in Spencer, but maybe I'll come back to you on that point. Thanks, Teo. Okay, Spencer, if you unmute yourself, you'll be able to speak.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I guess I'm a little concerned about this question of political significance, versus, I don't know what, reflection on cosmological questions and the like. And I want to come back, perhaps not to like a social account, a social historical account of science, but a social, in the sense of the concrete or specific content of different natural scientific disciplines, but rather how Marx and Engels help us to think about the question. So it seems to me that bourgeois radical thought understood that thinking about nature, that nature was once a part of society, right? That the cosmologies of the pre-modern world involved, thinking nature and society together through notions like the great chain of being. There would be many examples. And that nature emerges historically as a distinct object for scientific investigation was understood. And in this sense, I really don't agree with the counterposition of Rousseau to Newton.
It wasn't a counterposition. I mean, I was just speaking about influences and what is, I'm not saying that one is against the other. I'm saying that one part is something that we deal with and the other part is something that we don't deal with, but is nevertheless also clearly a part of what influences Kant. Kant certainly wouldn't have seen a counterposition, and I don't see why.
Just allow me to finish, but I do think that Rousseau would have an account of, how the historical necessity of how the historical necessity of nature as an object emerged, right? So, and of course, society also emerged as an object. It's not just the natural world, but it's science as an object for investigation that emerges at the same time. And in this sense, nature is a product of history for all the most advanced bourgeois thinkers. So my question for you is about, in a sense, what Marx and Engels have to say about the bourgeois radical account, its adequacy under conditions of capital. How did the emergence of the Industrial Revolution and the socialist workers' movement transform the way that bourgeois intellectuals, philosophers, and scientists alike operated within society? And how I guess I'm troubled by the fact that that you treat Engels as a case rather than a thinker of your problem. In other words, I'm asking you, how do Marx and Engels help you to understand the opposition between science and philosophy that you're describing? For instance, you talked about how in the middle of the 19th century, I think your term was, natural philosophy was transformed into natural science. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
Well, I mean, I think that there's several questions. I mean, so I think that Engels's spirit, particularly judged from a contemporary standpoint, actually runs counter to the separation. That the idea of a realm of natural science that operates autonomously from philosophy, or philosophy that does not engage with natural science, was alien to Engels is thinking. I don't think that science per se, natural science.
Do you think of that as just that Engels is just a sort of latter day 18th century philosopher in that respect?
In some ways, yes, and that's good. That's admirable. That the rise of science as a separate way of thinking. The word science is about 1830, right around the time that Hegel dies, almost exactly. Represents a breakdown, right, of something. Now, since then, there has been a further breakdowns. I don't think that Engels complains sometimes about empiricism of natural scientists. About,
I guess, to be very blunt, Richard, I guess, how do you understand the way that Engels is thinking about that breakdown in relationship to the breakdown or self-contradiction of liberalism, the breakdown of history, the breakdown of the revolution, the other preoccupations of Marx and Engels, which aren't just about, politics, but are, of course, vastly, philosophical reflections. And then that's why I was really balking at the distinction between, thinking about big questions and doing the work or something like that in your discussion with Theo. In other words, the questions that are motivating Marx and Engels' thought are also turning on what's happening from 1830 to 1848, right? And it's that historical thinking that I want to hear from you. Is that just absent in Engels, you think?
No, I'm not sure though what you're seeing as the problem. There's what's happening in society, right, which is the primary consideration of Marx and Engels. But there's also Engels as an intelligent amateur paying attention to the last 40, 50 years of natural science and what's happening there. Now, if you ask, well, is there a connection? Yes, there is a connection. I don't think that natural science appears to Engels yet as presenting a crisis the way there is a crisis of society. I think that the sense of a crisis in natural science comes more in the 20th century. I don't think that there's yet that sense in Engels, and I don't think there was really that sense anywhere. Natural science still appears to Engels to be basically fulfilling a progressive intellectual role. The limitations of natural scientists are their perhaps tendencies to empiricism. He comments on that many times. But I don't think there's a sense.
So why does he say that socialism would unleash natural science?
Because he sees both as tremendous progressive forces. In other words, natural science is good. If there is socialism, the potential of natural science will be intensified. I don't think that he yet sees the sense that capitalism is causing a crisis in natural science itself, at least while he's writing this. I think that sense is still a few decades in the future. And I think that Engels was not atypical in that sense, and that's a reasonable response. I don't think that people contemplating physics and biology in the 1870s would have felt a sense of crisis. They would have felt a sense of progress over the last half century. I think when you get to the turn of the 20th century, and particularly later on, with the revolutions of 20th century, particularly in physics, you do have a sense of crisis. You do have a sense that science itself is somehow mirroring the crisis of society, at least for some people, that there's a philosophical crisis. I don't think that that's yet visible in Engels' time when he's writing this.
Okay.
I'm not sure if that's really the answer to your question, but.
No, that's helpful. I think it also gets to some of what Kevin was asking.
Maybe I can follow up on that. Thanks, Spencer. just by asking about this term general social intellect, because it's another way that science is kind of talked about in Marxism, and that's one of the ways in which, I think this kind of follows on from the spirit of Spencer's comment, that that's one of the ways in which Marx and Engels see a problem in the 19th century under conditions of industrial capital, that society is unable to actually appropriate to itself the general social intellect, which would include the advancements in scientific knowledge, and that would in some ways account for a kind of separation of science from society. I mean, in other ways, science becomes more closely embedded in society through industrial production. But in your presentation, you mentioned, I can't remember which one it was, some scientific discovery of the 20th or 21st century, which had changed the way we think about everything for the past. People had thought about things for the past 2,500 years. But clearly, the way most people think about the world didn't change in that moment, right? So there's that kind of separation. Whereas with the 18th century, in the bourgeois revolutionary period, one has the sense that the advancements in scientific discovery are being kind of appropriated to a society that itself is developing freedom in a particular way, and that's not the case in the 19th century. So in that sense, there might be a case for saying that the crisis of science in its relation to society doesn't wait for the turn of the 20th century. Maybe you could respond to that, and also kind of how you see that term general social intellect, whether that's of importance here.
I'm not sure how to respond to the general social intellect. To the question about science, I mean, yes, there is a difference. So, part of the difference, and you get some sense of this, particularly in relationship to physics, right, is that the technical amount of technical mathematical knowledge required to follow physics increased dramatically, particularly around the middle of the 19th century. The amount of sophistication, so that presented a problem. I mean, but to some extent, even with Newton, you had a gap there. So yes, there is a breakdown. I think it depends on how you look at it, right? So if you look at, say, Victorian science or science of the 1870s from the standpoint of the 18th century, it seems much more detached and much more specialized in relationship to society, right? In terms of general social knowledge, intellect. In terms of our perspective, it seems much closer. It seems like there is still some of that 18th century involvement at a kind of popular level in terms of discussions about geology. Or, for example, this whole discussion about thermodynamics, it's remarkable how much of Victorian thought at a kind of popular level was involved in the ideas of thermodynamics and heat death and conservation of energy. It wasn't only at some technical scientific level. And you certainly see that with somebody like Newton in the 18th century. Even people didn't understand the technicalities. Like Newton was a symbol of the Enlightenment to people like Voltaire. Mm-hmm. Or a counter.
And so how does that relate to the goal of socialism, or even of like higher stage communism in terms of Spencer mentioned unleashing science in socialism, but there's also that kind of reappropriating the general social intellect to society.
So I think two things have to be essential. One is there's the question of technology, and Engels and Marx are concerned with both, right? Which is central to the development of capitalism in a particular way, right? So part of the specificity of capitalism as a social form is that a particular type of rational, social, and particularly mathematized inquiry into nature and domination of nature becomes not only possible, but socially necessary, right? To an extent that didn't exist. There is an impulse towards natural science and control of nature and technology in capitalism that did not exist in pre-capitalist society. And in that sense, the question of science and its instrumentalization becomes central to the problem of capitalism. I think that in the 20th century, particularly, that sense has often overwhelmed us. I think that in Engels' time, that there was still more of that Enlightenment optimism that just sapere aude, dare to know, that just knowing about nature and being able to control nature was a good thing. Now, in this Engels as eco-socialist argument, there are apparently examples of Engels talking about capitalist depredation of nature. I think that what's interesting there is the attempt of a certain type of ecological thought to not be Luddite, to not be anti-scientific. And so it's reaching towards this idea of Engels and Dialectics of Nature, which I think is a pretty big stretch, to avoid a kind of romantic anti-science, anti-technology approach and speak about nature and human effects in nature and nature's effects on us as, quote, dialectical, right? It's to see them as I think that that's the psychological motivation.
So I can't see, I don't know if I've missed anyone off. I can't see any more questions at the moment. One point that was just, if someone would like to raise their hand, we've got five more minutes. One point that you mentioned, Richard, is imagining whether any Marxist today would try to write what Engels, do something like what Engels had done. And you said, of course, no one has. But thinking about the symptomology of the dead left, there was the attempt by Ted Grant and Alan Woods, right, to literally update Engels for the 20th century discoveries of physics. How do you see? We've got two people who've just put their hand up. So briefly, how do you see that?
It's garbage.
What do you think motivates it? I mean, it comes from a particular strand of British Trotskyism.
I don't know. What it shows is that Trotskyists can be far more vulgar than Stalinists.
Meaning Haldane.
Yeah, I mean, if it's a choice, apparently they've done a new edition. We were talking about it before, a new edition of Dialectics of Nature. And Theo sent me the preface, and I think that you do better just reading Haldane's preface. It's more intelligent to me.
Okay, we've got Clint, Jensen, and Spencer. I'll allow the session to run over slightly in order to get all those people in, but then I'm afraid that will be it. So please try and keep your questions brief and to the point. So first, Clint.
Thanks. Just to sort of specify what we've been talking about, the cliche rejections of Engels that you mentioned, Richard, or that he's a mechanical materialist, or that he's like a labor ontologist. So how do you see this opening view of the dialectics of nature providing a different sort of light of like the task of the Second International with respect to like Victorian science, before we get to the crisis of science itself, like relativity, quantum, Hubble, etc. Without saying, without being able, so how does this sort of like open up so that we don't have to say that, okay, Engels is leading directly to Bernstein and Stalinism?
Well, I mean, the part about Engels leading to Stalinism is just absurd. I mean, It's a ridiculous charge. And again, I've tried to when I started this, by the way, I expected to be far more anti-Engels than I turned out to be. So I found that rereading this after many years, I was more sympathetic to Engels, as I said. I don't think one needs to particularly defend everything in Engels, Dialectics of Nature particularly. I think that there are parts of the materialist ontology that just don't work. And my problems with them are not about their supposed political effects, but that they don't seem to me to work within the context of a modern scientific view. Again, like the labor ontology, mechanical materialist, first of all, my thought is like, how do those two really fit together? I mean, as I read you something that claims that Engels was not a labor ontologist, but an energy ontologist, which is even crazier, I think that those labels speak to a psychological desire, to an anxiety about Marxism that just projects onto Engels with very little justification, some sort of anything that one feels uncomfortable about or thinks one feels uncomfortable about in Marxism. I really don't see them as having much to do with Engels. And certainly the Stalinism point, which is the real political point. I mean, that's just nonsense.
I guess what I'm getting at more is that, like, with this sort of wider cosmological view that Engels has with respect to the natural sciences and their progression, that becomes part of, like, the Belle Epoque. On the one hand, it's a much wider view of society, but it's also it's much more specific, because of this sense that, like, okay, through the technical domination processes of labor, we can actually overcome labor. And so, like, that sort of thing, that sort of aspect gets lost with, like, revisionism and Stalinism. So I'm just saying, like, how do you see it, like, this wider view that Engels has going into the 20th century? How do you see that with respect to, like, the emergence of the Second International?
I'm really not clear what you're sort of hung up on here. Like that I mean, the kind of views of Dialectics of Nature, I don't think that they would have, or anti-Düring, which is very closely related in time. And I mean, those were widely held in the Second International. I mean, is the question, are they outdated? I mean, what's interesting about these books is that they seem to continue to have some kind of relevance. I'm not sure, like, I'm understanding your question. So I feel like could you clarify it?
Well, it's a different sort of optimism that we have with the industrial progress of the Second Industrial Revolution. And so, I mean, we've been sort of dancing around this, like, okay, how does science and society connect? And I'm just trying to sort of get a view on, like, what sort of, like, how was the general social intellect that was sort of, emergent but in crisis going into the 20th century, how did that actually present, like, a rational form of society in terms of, this possible overcoming, like realizing labor in order to abolish labor? I don't know, that's maybe too general. We can move on.
Okay, I'm trying to see if...
Right, in the interest of time, then I'll bring in Jensen and then Spencer. Again, please try and keep your comments brief.
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback a little bit on Clint's comment, because I think maybe what I have to say is sort of close. I just wanted to point out that, Richard, when earlier you said that Engels' interest in cosmological questions was sort of, something that had trailed him his whole life, or was just a personal idiosyncrasy or something like that. I guess I wanted to underscore that, one thing I think that maybe has gone missing slightly here is how exactly the philosophy of nature figures in German idealism. and what the point of it, the point of a metaphysics of nature was for both Kant and Hegel. And one thing that's, important to keep in mind about both of them is that, for Kant in the Third Critique, humanity is regarded as the end of nature. The kingdom of ends is supposed to be the end or the final end of nature. And then Hegel ends the logic by saying that, spirit or the true and the good, these are the final end of the universe. So they're both, in a sense, for Kant, this is more of a moral problem, which for Hegel becomes a collective and social one. But in both cases, the cosmological question is in a sense, it's secularized. And, it becomes a question of, social self-realization as a way of fulfilling, the ends that we have as the specific kinds of natural beings that we are, as the highest form of a natural being. And this is why, in Hegel's system, if the point is to, ending at the end of the logic, it's to try to show that we can give an account of nature in its systematicity, that there is a certain way that nature must be understood. And if we understand nature as it must be understood, then, that will give way to an account of spirit. And that's why you have the pairing of the philosophy of nature and the philosophy of spirit, and the philosophy of spirit is rise out of the philosophy of nature.
I agree with the summary of Hegel's views. Engels would have issues with the word spirit, perhaps to a certain extent. He distances about, but yes, mostly that would be something that Engels would be in agreement with. The problem with the philosophy of nature aspect is its relationship to natural science itself. That's what I was focusing on, and the tension there. And I think that the fundamental problem with German idealism in terms of its philosophies of nature and is its tendency, even in Kant, but particularly in Hegel, towards rationalism. And that philosophically, the problem is the question of the inherent rationality of nature as opposed to its mere intelligibility, and the assumption that those two things are the same.
Well, but I don't think that is especially not true for Hegel, because part of what Hegel is saying is that there are components of nature that are irreducibly contingent, and part of giving a rational account is grasping those irreducibly irrational elements.
See this in the description of the existence, the categories of natural law, right? Which again, historically, is a relatively modern development, and why natural law exists, right? And the tendencies towards positivism in modern science, right? So for example, you have a tendency, and you see this in Engels all the time, to understand conservation laws as rooted in logical necessity, as philosophically based rather than empirically verified. So he believes in the indestructibility of matter, which is clearly false. He understands the conservation of energy in terms of the indestructibility of motion, which is a problematic, in many ways, understanding. And that understanding, as time went on, became more problematic. And also, it's problematic to assume that one's understanding of these things, that the existence of something being true, whatever the reason for it being true, can be understood logically, that we have to understand nature in this way. It's the problem with Kant's philosophy of geometry. Well, and this is where I'm getting too technical, but this is where, in fact, the crisis of modern physics actually, in many ways, is within a natural scientific realm, a moving away from many of the aspects of German idealism. That doesn't affect the question of the relevance of German idealism to the social realm, but it tends to bifurcate the two. And there's a huge bifurcation in terms of the way people have absorbed, say, Hegel's philosophy of nature and Hegel's philosophy of history. Clearly, his philosophy of history has been far more intellectually influential than his philosophy of nature, because his philosophy of nature is felt inherently to be problematic. Admittedly, it has defenders, but it's felt much more, it's defended much less vigorously, and its influence is much less.
Well, but that's also because, you know, the descriptions that we have of it are, I mean, they're mostly pretty bad, or they're vulgarizing. And they take it that, you know, Hegel is trying to deduce the, you know, rational number of planets or something like that. And that's
okay, but
all right, Richard, sorry, I want to bring Spencer in before we have to end the session and get too far into whether Hegel students properly took down the lectures. But thanks, Jensen. Okay, Spencer, if you unmute yourself, you can speak.
Hi. Yeah, two things. One, and they're both invitations to sort of concluding remarks for you, Richard. One is with respect to this question of rewriting the Dialectics of Nature by Allen and Grant, or whoever it was,
yeah,
as hopelessly vulgar in your view. But also there are many examples of people attempting to update or rewrite Capital,
yeah,
which also strike us in a similar way. And of course, we're, you know, the alternative to that is a kind of philological approach to the text of the great men of the 19th century in Marxism. And I wonder how you would reflect on the philosophy debate within Platypus in terms of that, right? In other words, rather than, you know, the question of, you know, the abiding significance of the philosophical questions, the way in which these questions were, you know, that there's only one Marx and Engels, that Marxism doesn't really have other Marx and Engelses on, you know, that advanced capital. You know, you could say that Lenin's work is really engaged, you know, with philosophy in the way that Engels's is, but not really. And you could say even that Rosa Luxemburg is engaged with political economy in the way that Marx is, but not really. And after the failure of Marxism, after the collapse and crisis of Marxism, there's, you know, really no successor to Marx and Engels. And that's the sense in which the problem is a political problem, you know, which is different from, you know, a call to activism or a contemptuous dismissal of, you know, anything practical. The other thing and so that's one question. And the other question that I'd ask you to address in the spirit of your sort of first half of your remarks before you got into the specificity is if you could conclude in honor of the man's 200th birthday on how you think about the Marx-Engels relationship. Because it does seem to me fairly unique. And that, you know, Marx really couldn't have been the thinker that he was without that friendship. And that to a large degree, you know, and certainly something like the correspondence between Marx and Engels when, you know, they were writing all the time, when one was in London and the other was in Manchester, is a fairly unique textual, intellectual, political phenomenon. You know, it's hard to imagine any correspondence that quite has that character and significance. but more broadly, that relationship between Marx and Engels as founders of Marxism.
Well, on that point, I think I agree with you completely. I mean, the more I read about both men, the greater my respect for them. The fact that Marx and Engels were two different people who actually had not, contrary to what some anti-Engels people claim, different philosophical outlooks, which I don't believe, but they did have to some extent different interests, different talents, different temperaments. And this was something that they complemented each other, that they, so one of the arguments that Engels, the vulgarizer, is that Engels actually wrote more popular books. That was his talent. But that doesn't mean that he was a vulgarizer. Being a popularizer isn't a vulgarizer. And Marx certainly didn't see him as a vulgarizer. And specifically with this question about this book of Dialectics of Nature, I mean, this was something that Engels actually had a significant knowledge of and interest in and read a lot about. Marx did not. He pursued other studies. Engels often played a political role in terms of, as you well know, took on a particularly political role. And fundamentally, of course, there's the fact that Engels subsidized Marx, that Marx depended on him financially. I mean, in fact, one of the most bizarre arguments of the anti-Engels brigade is the claim that the reason Marx didn't denounce Engels, and I think this is a profoundly insulting view of Marx as well as Engels, is that Marx was financially dependent on Engels. I think it's ridiculous.
And there were times that Engels was financially dependent on Marx.
In his early life? When was that?
During the revolution, when Engels was completely cut off from his family.
Oh yeah, early. Yeah, okay.
There's a long time before Engels is a rich man and a capitalist. And their friendship.
I don't know the details, but I mean certainly I mean in terms of like at that level. But and the fact that he did that was a huge personal sacrifice for Engels, because Engels hated, working in his family's business. He did not want to be a capitalist businessman. He didn't like that. That was not the life he wanted to be leading. And that was something he did for the sake of the partnership.
Richard, could you just address the first part of Spencer's question, which was about
the uniqueness of that moment and the people who are Marx and Engels?
No, it was more about the philosophy debate in Platypus. Spencer, maybe you can just repose it for Richard's closing comments.
Oh, so I would say, I mean, most of the philosophy debate in Platypus, particularly the stuff that has come out, like the Theo Jensen versus Chris stuff, seems to me mostly about a relationship between Hegel and Marx. And so the type of issues that I've brought up here are actually focused on a very different aspect.
Right. So what I'm asking you to reflect on, Richard, is the inevitability of the way in which the debate is about the relation of Hegel and Marx, rather than the possibility of writing dialectical philosophy today.
Again, I think that there is a tension. I spoke about a tension between philosophy and natural science in a certain context and two different visions of philosophy. And I think that in Platypus, but also in Marxism to some extent, there tends often to be a tension between the possibility of politics and philosophy. I think that the more blocked Marxism seems in terms of an actual political realization, the more Marxists tend to be thrown back on questions of philosophy. I think that I'm not sure why exactly that is, but it's something that I've noticed as a pattern. And I think that to some extent that's true in Platypus, this, even though philosophy tends to be understood in Marxism as something that you do for some ultimate political purpose, there's also the phenomenon that the sense of history being blocked leads one to reflect upon philosophy. It also leads one to reflect either on the relationship between Hegel and Marx, because Hegel is particularly the nodal point at which the relationship between history and philosophy is fundamentally transformed intellectually, and it's the point one keeps going back to. Or in a sense, what I'm talking about, where I'm talking about more not the Marx-Hegel relationship, but the imagined Marx-Engels relationship, which, as I said, is a fiction. But I think it also speaks to the idea that Marxism within itself contains potential tensions and how one navigates those intellectual tensions. So I did focus a lot on the ideas of people whom I disagree with in terms of a debate between, a quote, debate between Marxism and Engelsism, right? So one book by Norman Levine is called, about Engelsism, it's The Great Betrayal, right? Now, the actual thesis strikes me as ridiculous, but the fact that one would write a book about philosophy, understanding philosophy and Marxism in terms of betrayal and failure, actually seems to me ultimately about an inability to process political failures and political betrayals that manifest itself in this abstract and implausible philosophical accusation against Engels. I'm not sure if that satisfies you, but that's sort of mine.
I think that's a good point to end on. Thank you very much, Richard. Thanks to everyone for attending and for participating in today's presentation. If you are interested in learning more about platypus, as I said, you can go to our website, platypus1917.org. Various articles by Chris Catrone, Jensen Souther, and Theo Velisaris from the latest issue of the Platypus Review were mentioned.
A philosophy issue.
Yes, we also have articles by myself, Pamela Nogales, and Laurie Rojas. And you can check out the Platypus Review there. You can find the link to send submissions to the editor, as it's an open submission journal. So thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you, Efraim.